Welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week we are joined again by our first guest, Philos's founder and president, Robert Nicholson. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you for being back here. Our first episode together, we talked about the ICJ ruling, what genocide means, and how the international community responded. And over the last few weeks, we've had some of these big existential questions emerge with the likelihood of a Rafah ground offensive. Since our last episode with Hadil, where we talked about how Rafah is the last holding for Hamas leaders and why it's strategically important for Israel, we've seen the international community, especially the United States, shift its rhetoric in talking about what a temporary ceasefire could look like. And I want to note that shift in the Biden administration's rhetoric, which has been very careful to not call for a ceasefire during this war. The U.S. did veto a third draft resolution at the UN Security Council, which called for a humanitarian ceasefire, but they did propose a draft resolution that would call for a temporary ceasefire and oppose the ground offensive in Rafah. So I do want to note this marks the first time the U.S. has now pushed for a ceasefire in the UN, which strategically does put Israel in a different position if they were to maybe lose that close alliance with the United States. And yesterday, Israel gave Hamas its ultimatum. It's kind of counter to their proposed permanent ceasefire proposal, which is return all the hostages by March 10th, which this year is the start of Ramadan, giving them a 3-week period to do so, or they will move forward with that planned ground offensive. And in the midst of all these talks about when will this offensive start, we've seen the conversation at the international level begin on what happens to a Palestinian state, what happens in Gaza after the end of this war. I think most people in the international community recognize that an offensive in Rafah would mark the end of a phase 1 in this conflict. So Netanyahu rejected any unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, as the international community has called for it. And this week, Palestinian representatives asked judges at the ICJ to declare Israel's occupation illegal, which they see as a first step in a two-state solution and quote unquote lasting peace process. So Robert, that's a lot. I would love to kind of hear why you think even the United States and a lot of key international actors are opposing a ground offensive in Rafah.
These are difficult questions to answer. I think it's important to take one step back and just remind ourselves what we're doing here. So we all know what happened on October 7th, 2023, the Hamas massacre, horrific killing, also rapes. I just saw a new report that's out, which documents the fact that not only were Hamas terrorists raping people, they were forcing families to watch. Right? This is really the most unspeakable and most well-documented crime that I've seen in the Near East in a long time. Weeks passed during which Israel conducted various airstrikes on Hamas targets inside the Gaza Strip. And on October 27th, 20 days later, the IDF launched its ground offensive. At that point, the IDF began to systematically work its way through the Gaza Strip, trying to divide and isolate the main population areas, places like Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah also, and has systematically moved since October 27th through almost all of the Gaza Strip, with the exception of one tiny place, and that's Rafah, right? So the best way to understand Rafah is as the Alamo of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. There is going to be, no doubt, in phase 2 of this conflict, a systematic insurgency, no doubt, on the part of Hamas and Hamas sympathizers who go underground and do what we saw Al-Qaeda and later ISIS do in Iraq, which is to launch these kind of guerrilla-style terrorist attacks against the IDF. But phase 1, the rooting out of the Hamas infrastructure, is all but completed with the exception of Rafah, right? So Why are international voices so adamant that this city, this one last place, this Alamo, be spared? I would say that there are a couple of different things coming together. One is that, as we've seen and continue to see in the news, Hamas shockingly has millions of sympathizers all over the world. And if the IDF conquers this city, the last Hamas stronghold in the Gaza Strip will be gone forever. A lot of people don't like that. A lot of people in the Arab world, the Islamic world, and people in other parts of the world who, for whatever reason, ideological or otherwise, want Hamas to be preserved. On the part of some European countries and the United States, there is a dilemma because although many of them, certainly the United States, have been very vociferous, very strong, standing up for Israel at the Security Council, as you mentioned, and elsewhere, over time, as time passes, their own constituencies, whether it's Muslim populations in places like France or the UK, or a combination of Muslims and ultra progressive Democrats here in the U.S., are pushing their leaders to do more. Right? There are many accusations against President Biden, against his administration, for being one-sided, for not only turning a blind eye to quote unquote genocide in the Gaza Strip, but actually facilitating it. In an election year, those accusations are possibly, especially in a place like Michigan with a large Muslim and Arab American population, possibly fatal. And the Biden administration is trying to do two things at once, right? It's trying on one hand to maintain the support for the IDF, by the IDF time, allow it to root out Hamas from the Gaza Strip, while also throwing bones to their base or certain parts of their base that don't like that this is happening. And that's why you see these excessive calls for humanitarian aid, even though the Israel is bringing in as much aid as arriving at the checkpoint, and able to facilitate as much aid as possible. That's why you're seeing this sudden, call for a Palestinian state declared unilaterally, in New York City or in some other international capital. And that's why you're seeing this demand that the IDF, now on the brink of a victory, stop short of Rafah and let the Hamas fighters inside there, including the leader, Yahya Sinwar, to survive, to live to fight another day. Obviously, I think as Americans, as Christians, it is absolutely wrong to stand, in any way for the continued existence of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Right? Hamas is an ideology to some extent, but it's also an organization. Right? It's got infrastructure. It's got people. You're never going to be able to eliminate an idea, but you can eliminate the physical footprint of that idea in a particular place. And that's what Israel's trying to do for its own citizens, for the Palestinians in Gaza, and for the whole region. And I think we should let them do it.
As you mentioned, questions of a Palestinian state are now emerging naturally as Hamas is losing its grip in Gaza. What is a two-state solution looking like now? And is it viable in a post-October 7th world? And maybe even more so, is it viable with Hamas still in power? Is getting Hamas out of Gaza kind of that first step to a longer lasting peace process?
If you had asked me on October 8th if here in February we'd be seriously considering, as the international community, the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state with no negotiations with Israel, after all that's happened over the past 30 years, I would have said you're insane, right? There's absolutely no way. We are, and I say this as somebody who's been a strong supporter of the two-state solution as long as I've been doing this work. We have never been further from that reality, right? Not only are the Palestinians divided between Hamas and the PLO, not only are we see what at least one side of the Palestinian national movement does and is willing to do, right? These horrible acts of cruelty. Not only do we know that the other side, the PLO side, is actually not as moderate as we would have liked, not willing, not able to call out these atrocities, but it's also extremely illegitimate, corrupt in the eyes of its people, so that even in the place where it rules, the West Bank, something like 80% of Palestinians prefer Hamas, right? This is where we're at right now. And the idea that now, of all times, right, a lot has happened. There have been lots of ebbs and flows in Israeli-Palestinian relations, right? Moments where it seemed like peace was just in the offing. But to think that now, the moment when we are as far from that reality as possible, when the Palestinian street, when Palestinian society appears more eager for violence, more radicalized by Islamic end times theology, more willing to kill in the name of their own nationalism, still telling themselves the story of the Jews, not as real Jews, but as some kind of foreign invaders masquerading as Jews, right? That in this moment, we're going to push for that. And not only push for it, but push for it at the UN, right? Not actually on the ground with the cooperation of the people involved. I mean, who are the leaders on the Palestinian side? Mahmoud Abbas, the person who says that Hamas needs to be part of any Palestinian government of a Palestinian state. I mean, he said this recently. It's absurd. It's frankly, it's immoral, and I can't even understand those who at this point are making the argument. I understand that we all want to see peace, and that so long as Israelis and Palestinians live in this land, there is going to have to be some kind of arrangement, right? Some kind of, God willing, a peace process. But to say that we're going to cram that down the Israelis' throats now is actually going to backfire, because the Israelis, after 10/7, are not in any mood to swallow bitter pills from the international community. They are determined to protect their people, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and otherwise, and to do whatever they have to do to make sure that that happens. So if we push a Palestinian state, we're actually guaranteeing that whatever that Palestinian state is going to likely collapse, either under its own weight or in opposition to the state of Israel. It's a very, very bad idea.
I want to piggyback off what you said with Hamas's growing popularity in the West Bank. Is there a legitimate fear that even if the IDF can eliminate Hamas in Gaza, that support will spill over ideologically in the West Bank and kind of create another cell of Hamas, where now the PA currently has control?
It's not a fear, it's a reality. I mean, there are at least 1,000 Hamas fighters in the West Bank. Hamas has long had a footprint in the West Bank, even when the IDF was aware of it, and the PLO, the PA, was aware of it. Now, after 10/7, things have gotten worse. The support on the street for Hamas has grown. People now who weren't supporters of Hamas, having seen Hamas's victories against, the Zionist occupier, are more likely to sympathize with them than ever before, right? So the potential number of fighters has grown. And you're seeing in places like Jenin, which were already, before October 7th, hotbeds of resistance, a real spike in terrorists willing to go out and kill others, kill themselves in the name of this narrative. So the IDF has stepped up operations in the West Bank, even as it's prosecuting its war in Gaza. The irony of all of this is that the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas himself, is terrified of Hamas, right? And wants nothing to do with them, has staked his, most of his adult career on being opposed, at least formally, to this, Muslim eschatology and all the stuff that goes along with it. But because he's so afraid of his base and so afraid of the opinion of the Arab and Islamic world, he is unwilling to say that publicly, trying to be, both things. He's become nothing. and no one supports him, either on the Israeli side or on the Palestinian side. So that it's just really a matter of time before he is removed from office one way or the other. And the big question after that is, okay, then what happens, right? Who steps up and fills the void? Now, Israel's trying to do its best, working with Arab partners in the region to think through that question, think through what happens on the day after. Who could come in, someone come in from the outside, either a Palestinian in exile or, some combination of these Arab states to help, at least in the interim, police these areas so that Hamas doesn't appear and take over in the West Bank, much closer to Israeli population areas. But that's much easier said than done. How do you de-radicalize people? That's a great phrase, but what does it actually mean? How do you take ideas out of people's heads? How do you cool that animosity that has been stoked for a century? How do you reformulate the Palestinian national narrative if you're not a Palestinian, right? Palestinians need to lead, right? Everybody's said for a long time, where is the Nelson Mandela? Where is the Martin Luther King Jr. of the Palestinians? Insofar as that person still has not risen um, and gained the acceptance of the street, we're in a position where there's really no other option but continued military rule, occupation. You can call it that if you want, for the foreseeable future.
And Robert, I'm going to ask you to look into a crystal ball here because obviously no one will really know what's going to happen before March 10th. But with your understanding of the war and just your deep understanding of the region and past conflicts, do you think Hamas will respond favorably to the ultimatum provided by Israel to return all the hostages by the start of Ramadan? And if not, do you foresee Ramadan kind of being this tension point where more violence will occur in the West Bank and maybe even also in Jerusalem during this holy holiday?
Look, it's very hard to ascertain what's really happening. There are layers on layers of things that we don't know. I do know that there are good people, sincere people trying to forge a deal. And I don't underestimate their skill, their cleverness in trying to come to some sort of arrangement here over the next few weeks. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. Right now, Hamas demands are just, especially given the horrors that this organization has perpetrated, just absolutely ridiculous, right? They're not even worth entertaining. I do think it's possible. However, from the perspective of Hamas and its sympathizers around the world, Ramadan is a great gift, right? Every year throughout the Islamic world, Ramadan, the coming of this month-long Islamic fast, it's a holy month in the Islamic calendar, is anticipated with trembling, right? Where will a riot break out? We've seen them, especially in recent years, surrounding Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right? Palestinian supporters around the world rising up during Ramadan in various ways to, oppose the Zionists or the West or what have you. And what you see in those moments is a tremendous groundswell of support around the world, right? It's a real month of Islamic solidarity. And, from Hamas's perspective, there's a real reason to try to bide your time, to try to wait for Ramadan to come, because whatever the pressure against Israel is right now, it's going to increase exponentially, especially when Hamas drafts, useful idiots in the West who, start talking about how could we do such things during the holy month of Ramadan, et cetera, right? This is the rhetoric that you could expect to see. And if you're Hamas, that's really the perfect situation to drag this out even longer. Hamas wants to survive, right? They want to retain their power or some semblance of it inside the Gaza Strip. They are willing to do whatever they can do to make sure that happens. They will make a deal if they have to, and it will only they'll only make that decision when pressured by military force. We've seen that, right? Negotiations on their own do not work, but they are going to try, if I had to predict, to drag this out as long as possible, and maybe even into Ramadan, in which case, the stakes go up even higher.
And I want to point out as we close, they're willing to drag that out for their own survival as an organization, even with the 1.4 refugees in Rafah who they hide behind. That's something I wanted to emphasize as we close. Um, as
And let me
international,
just, yeah,
yeah, please.
that is really a very important point, because even though Israeli hostages are still being held, and one shudders to think what they're going through every single day, right? These, you think the months have dragged out for you and I. Imagine if you're one of these people and what you've gone through, right? Not only are they there, not only are the soldiers of Israel and their families being dragged through this month after month, these Palestinian civilians, right, who have there's no ray of light for them at the end of this situation, right? If you're Israeli, at least you can go home, right? That's the hope, and you can be secure, make sure that this never happens again. If you're one of these Palestinian refugees in Rafah, what is your future, right? Hamas, whether they stay or go, the Palestinian Authority, illegitimate, corrupt, not on your side, the Israelis, the Americans. I dare say that the Palestinians who've supported Hamas in Gaza have only themselves to blame. But that's not everyone, right? There are people there, especially now, who realize that this organization has brought them only destruction and bloodshed. And there are, and I hope a growing number of them, glad to see Hamas rooted out. But they are the most affected victims of this assault. Unfortunately, the world places the blame at the feet of Israel. As if Israel just woke up and decided to go invade Gaza. It's ridiculous to think that. The blame deserves to be laid at the feet of Hamas, and I hope that more Palestinians there on the ground, and then supporters around the world are starting to see that. I hope so.
I do too. And we as Christians have a lot to pray for. And maybe that first step in praying for peace and pluralism is for the innocent Palestinian civilians kind of caught in the middle of this power struggle for the region. Well, thank you, Robert. You give us a very comprehensive view of the region and what's going on, and we'll continue to follow this here on the Fearless Project podcast. You can follow us on all streaming services. And Robert, you're on X and Instagram, and you can follow all of our organization accounts as well on all social media platforms. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.